This story is titled Golden Child Brother Stole and Destroyed. My brand new truck and my parents sided with him. So I got him arrested and cut contact with my parents. And now they are begging for help. Hey everyone. Before we jump into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed the channel is losing some traction, and subscribing is one of the best ways you can support us. It's quick, free, and it helps us keep bringing you awesome content. Your support means the world. Let's keep this channel growing together. Thanks so much. Now let's start the video. If my childhood had a soundtrack, it'd be the constant echo of my parents saying, "Mike didn't mean it, Eli. He's just young." Growing up in my family, you could have put a neon sign over my brother Mike's 22 male head that read Golden Boy. He could break every rule in the book, and somehow my parents, Sharon and Doug, would still manage to twist things around so that it wasn't his fault. Meanwhile, I, Eli, 21 male, was stuck as the scapegoat. If Mike broke something, it was my fault for not keeping an eye on him. If he failed a class, it was because I didn't help him study. You get the picture. Mike always had this ridiculous sense of entitlement, like everything I had automatically belonged to him too. When we were kids, he'd steal my toys and destroy them. I remember one time I saved up for months to buy this fancy RC car I'd been wanting forever. The thing was awesome, super fast, sleek design, and even had working headlights. Mike begged me to let him play with it, and like an idiot, I gave in. He smashed it into a curb within 5 minutes and laughed about it. When I ran to my mom crying, she just said, "Boys will be boys. You can't expect him to be careful at his age." He was 12, old enough to know better. By the time we were teenagers, the theft got worse. Mike would take my clothes, my money, even my bike. He once rode my bike to school and left it out in the rain for 3 days because he forgot where he parked it. I found it rusted and trashed in a ditch. When I blew up at him, my mom just sighed, "You need to share, Eli. You're brothers." Meanwhile, my parents acted like I was some kind of charity case they were being forced to support. I worked my ass off babysitting, mowing lawns, and shoveling driveways to save for college, but I still had to ask them for little things like gas money or help buying school supplies. Every time it came with a lecture about learning the value of money and how it's not our job to spoil you. Then there was Mike. The golden boy could destroy anything he touched, and my parents would bend over backward to replace it. His first car, a crappy old Toyota, lasted 6 months before he totaled it, driving like a maniac. My parents bought him another car, a beat-up Honda, which he wrecked within a year. Did they let him suffer the consequences? Of course not. They just found him another junk car, saying, "He's young, he'll learn." I didn't even get a chance to learn. By the time I turned 18, I'd had enough. After one particularly bad fight, where Mike managed to break my laptop by borrowing it, and then blamed me for leaving it somewhere he could grab it, I decided to leave. I called my Uncle Frank, my mom's older brother, who'd always been the only sane adult in my life. Uncle Frank is a retired cop, no nonsense but fair, and he agreed to let me move in with him. He even gave me his old truck, a Ford F-150 that had been with him for years. The F-150 wasn't flashy, but it was solid, a workhorse. It had a few dents and scratches from Frank's years on the job, but I didn't care. It was mine, and it was the first thing in my life I didn't have to share with Mike. That truck became my pride and joy. I kept it clean, learned how to do basic maintenance on it, and even started doing small side gigs hauling stuff for people. It gave me independence, which I desperately needed after 18 years of being treated like an afterthought. Of course, Mike hated the truck. He couldn't stand that I had something he didn't. Anytime I drove it over to my parents' house, he'd find some excuse to complain. "Why do you get a truck?" he'd whine. "Mom and Dad didn't buy me a truck. That's not fair." I'd remind him again and again that Uncle Frank gave it to me. Not our parents, but it didn't matter. In Mike's mind, anything nice I had was something he was entitled to. Things came to a head when Mike wrecked his third car. He was driving like an idiot, as usual, and smashed it into a street pole. He showed up at my parents' house the next day, acting like the world had ended. "What am I supposed to do now?" he complained. "I need a car to get to work." My mom looked at me like I was holding the solution to all of life's problems. "Eli, why don't you let your brother borrow your truck? He really needs it." I didn't even hesitate. "No." Mike's jaw practically hit the floor. "What do you mean, no? You don't even use it all the time." "It's my truck," I said, "and I'm not letting you wreck it like you wrecked your other cars." Cue the guilt trips. My mom started in with, "Eli, he's your brother. Family helps family." My dad chimed in, "You're being selfish. You can take the bus for a few days." But I wasn't budging. That truck was my livelihood. I used it to get to work, to run errands, and for my side gigs. Letting Mike drive it would be like handing him the keys to my life and watching him smash it into a wall. I refused. Mike sulked for days, and my parents gave me the cold shoulder, acting like I'd just committed a federal crime by saying no. Honestly, I was starting to feel guilty, even though I knew I was right. That's what they were good at, making me feel like the bad guy even when I was the only one being reasonable. I thought that was the end of it. I should have known better. Mike wasn't the type to take no for an answer, and my parents weren't the type to hold him accountable. What happened next was the start of a disaster I'll never forget. I should have known Mike wasn't going to let it go. The thing about him is that he doesn't hear no the way normal people do. To Mike, no just means try again later, or figure out how to get around it. I didn't see it at the time, but when he wrecked his third junk car and I refused to lend him my truck, he wasn't defeated. He was planning his next move. A few days after our argument, I was leaving work and heading to the parking lot. I always parked my truck in the same spot, a little further out where fewer cars would be around to ding it. But when I got there, my truck was gone. At first, I thought maybe I'd parked somewhere else and just forgot. But after walking the entire lot twice, it hit me. Mike. I don't know how, but I knew. I called him immediately. He picked up after a few rings, sounding way too casual. Hey bro, what's up? Where's my truck, Mike? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady even though I was seeing red. Oh, don't worry about it. I just borrowed it for a bit. I'll bring it back soon, he said, like it was no big deal. Are you kidding me? Bring it back right now, or I'm calling the cops. You're overreacting, he scoffed. It's just a truck. I hung up and started pacing. How the hell had he even gotten into my truck? I always kept the keys with me, and there was no way he'd hotwired it. Mike wasn't exactly a criminal mastermind. That's when I remembered something I'd read online about spare keys. Some models of F-150s had keys that were easy to replicate if you knew the VIN number. The realization made my blood boil. Mike had actually gone out of his way to buy a key just so he could steal my truck. About 30 minutes later, he pulled into the lot, grinning like this was all some hilarious prank. My truck was filthy, mud splattered all over the sides, fast food wrappers littering the passenger seat, and a faint smell of cigarettes in the air. Mike climbed out like he'd done me a favor. See? No harm, no foul, he said, tossing me the keys. I lost it. What the hell is wrong with you, Mike? You stole my truck. You trashed it. Relax, it's not a big deal, he said, shrugging. I needed a ride to work. You weren't even using it. Are you insane? I snapped. You don't get to decide when I'm not using my truck. You have no idea how much I rely on it. At this point, a couple of my co-workers were walking by, and I could tell they were trying not to stare. Great. On top of everything else, Mike was making a scene and embarrassing me in front of people I work with. I told him to leave, but not before making it crystal clear. If he ever touched my truck again, I'd call the cops. Mike just laughed and walked off like I was joking. That was the thing about him. He never took anything seriously. He always assumed that if he pushed hard enough, someone else would clean up his mess. That night, I called Uncle Frank and told him what happened. I was half expecting him to lecture me for not calling the cops right then and there, but instead, he just sighed. I'm not surprised, he said. Your brother's been getting away with this crap for too long. You've got to set some boundaries. He offered to help me install a GPS tracker in the truck, just in case Mike tried something like this again. Frank wasn't the type to say things like, I told you so, but I could tell he was thinking it. Next time, don't even call him. Just call the cops. He needs to learn there are consequences. The next morning, I spent a good 2 hours cleaning the truck. The mud was caked on so thick that it looked like Mike had driven it through a swamp. The interior was just as bad. Fast food grease stains on the seats, soda spills on the floor mats, and the cigarette smell that wouldn't go away no matter how much air freshener I used. It felt like a personal violation. That truck wasn't just a vehicle to me. It was my independence, my way out of the dysfunction I'd grown up with. And Mike had treated it like garbage. When I got home, my mom called. I thought maybe she'd heard about what happened and wanted to apologize, but of course I was wrong. Eli, she started, in that tone she always used when she was about to scold me. Mike told me you yelled at him last night. Was that really necessary? Are you serious right now? I asked. He stole my truck, Mom. He borrowed it, she corrected, and he said he brought it back. You didn't need to make such a big deal about it. He didn't borrow it. Borrowing implies permission. He stole it, and he trashed it. You're being so dramatic, she said, sighing like I was the problem. You know how hard things have been for him lately? He's your brother, Eli. Family helps family. I hung up on her. I couldn't deal with the mental gymnastics anymore. No matter what Mike did, they always found a way to justify it. And no matter how much I stood up for myself, they always made me feel like I was the bad guy. For a few weeks, things were quiet. Mike avoided me, probably because he didn't want to deal with another argument, and my parents gave me the silent treatment. Part of me thought maybe they'd finally realized I wasn't going to roll over anymore. But the truth was, they were just waiting for the next opportunity to put Mike's problems on my shoulders. Uncle Frank's advice was starting to make more sense. If Mike ever pulled something like this again, I wasn't going to argue or negotiate. I'd call the cops and let him deal with the fallout. What I didn't realize was that the next time Mike took my truck, things would escalate far beyond what I could have imagined. By the time Christmas rolled around, things between me, Mike, and the rest of the family were still tense. After the whole stolen truck fiasco, Mike had been avoiding me, and my parents were giving me their usual cold shoulder. But it was Christmas, and like every year, I still showed up to the family gathering. I wasn't there for them. I came for my cousins, my Uncle Frank, and the food. The day started off fine enough, but it didn't take long for the cracks to show. As soon as I walked through the door, my mom gave me one of her passive-aggressive greetings. "Oh, Eli, you made it. I wasn't sure you'd show up after all the drama this month," she said, loud enough for everyone in the living room to hear. I ignored her, dumped my coat on the nearest chair, and headed straight for the kitchen. Frank was already there, sipping coffee and chatting with Aunt Linda. "Merry Christmas, kid," he said, giving me a firm pat on the back. He must have seen the irritation on my face because he leaned in and muttered, "Let it roll off. Don't let her get to you." The day dragged on with the usual holiday chaos. Kids running around, aunts and uncles arguing over politics, and my mom sneaking in little digs whenever she thought no one was listening. "Eli's gotten so protective of that truck," she said to one of my cousins. "It's like he thinks it's made of gold." I clenched my jaw but stayed quiet. No point in starting a fight over Christmas dinner. Mike, on the other hand, was acting unusually quiet. He stayed glued to his phone most of the day, barely making eye contact with anyone. It felt off, but I figured he was sulking because I'd shut him down so hard last time we spoke. I didn't care. I was happy to have him stay out of my way. As the evening wore on, I noticed something odd. My truck keys, which I always kept clipped to my belt loop, were missing. At first, I thought maybe I'd dropped them somewhere, so I started retracing my steps. I checked the kitchen, the living room, even the bathroom, but they were nowhere to be found. That's when the dread started creeping in. I stepped outside, and sure enough, my truck wasn't parked in the driveway where I'd left it. I felt my stomach drop. Pulling out my phone, I opened the GPS tracker app. The little dot that represented my truck was already a few miles away, moving fast. I stormed back inside and called Mike. "Where's my truck, Mike?" I demanded. He didn't even try to deny it. "Relax, bro. I'm just picking up a friend. I'll bring it back in, like, an hour." "You stole my truck again?" My voice was loud enough to make everyone in the room stop what they were doing. "It's not stealing if we're family," Mike said, shrugging. "Don't be so uptight. It's Christmas." Before I could respond, Frank walked in, immediately sensing the tension. "What's going on?" he asked. "Mike took my truck, again," I said, practically shouting. Frank's jaw tightened, but before he could say anything, my mom swooped in. "Oh, come on, Eli, it's Christmas. Can't you just let it go for one day?" "No, I can't let it go," I snapped. "It's not his truck, and he has no right to take it." Frank gave me a nod and pulled me aside. "Check the tracker. Let's see where he's headed." I opened the app, and that's when I noticed something terrifying. The truck's dot had stopped moving, and it was in the middle of a highway exit ramp. I immediately called Mike, but he didn't pick up. The third time I tried, he finally answered. "What now?" he said, sounding annoyed. "Where are you? The tracker says you're on the highway." There was a pause, and then his tone shifted. Yeah, about that. I kinda lost control on the ice. The truck's fine, though. It's just stuck in a ditch." "You what?" I yelled, making no effort to hide my fury. Everyone in the room was staring now. Mike mumbled something about the roads being bad and hung up. I threw on my coat, grabbed Frank, and headed for the door. "We're going to get my truck," I said, ignoring my mom's half-hearted, "Be nice to your brother." When we got to the scene, my truck was nose-deep in a snowbank. The front bumper was crumpled, the left headlight shattered, and the grille was bent beyond recognition. Mike was standing by the side of the road, his arms crossed like this whole thing was somehow my fault. "It's not that bad," he said as I stepped out of the car. "It's just cosmetic." "You wrecked my truck," I said, through gritted teeth. "What the hell were you thinking?" "The roads are icy," he shot back. "It's not my fault." At that moment, a police cruiser pulled up behind us, lights flashing. I wasn't surprised. Someone probably called it in. The officer stepped out, looked at the truck, then at Mike. "What happened here?" he asked. Before Mike could say a word, my mom and dad pulled up in their van, rushing over like they were here to save the day. "Officer, this is all a misunderstanding," my mom started. "Eli was driving and—" "Don't even start," I cut her off. "Mike stole my truck. I have the GPS logs to prove it. The officer raised an eyebrow and turned to Mike. Is that true? Mike stammered, but Frank jumped in. He's been drinking too. You might want to check. Sure enough, they gave Mike a breathalyzer, and he failed. He was cuffed on the spot for driving under the influence and driving on a suspended license. My mom started wailing, begging the officer to be reasonable, but Frank shut her down. Enough, Sharon. Let him face the consequences for once. I stayed silent as they loaded Mike into the cruiser. My truck was pulled out of the ditch, but the damage was done. As we drove back to the house, Frank glanced over at me. Next time, don't wait for him to screw up. Call the cops the moment he pulls this crap. He was right, but this was just the beginning. Mike wasn't done causing chaos, and I was far from done dealing with it. The ride back to the house after Mike's arrest was dead silent. My parents sat in the front of their van, probably stewing over how unfair it was that Mike got arrested. Frank and I were in the back seat, and he looked as calm as ever. That's one thing about Frank. Nothing rattles him. But me? I was pissed. Not just at Mike, but at my parents for enabling him for so long. They hadn't said a word to me, but I knew what was coming. The moment we walked through the front door, my mom spun around, her face red with anger. How could you let this happen to your brother? She hissed. I stared at her in disbelief. Let this happen? He stole my truck, wrecked it, and was drinking while driving on a suspended license. That's on him, not me. He's your brother, she snapped. You should have handled this privately, not dragged the cops into it. Frank stepped in before I could explode. Sharon, your son broke the law. Multiple laws. This isn't something you can sweep under the rug. Don't talk to me like I don't know how to handle my own children, Frank, she shot back. You've always played favorites with Eli, making Mike look like the bad guy. Frank laughed dryly. Mike doesn't need help looking like the bad guy. He does that just fine on his own. Before she could respond, my dad chimed in. Look, let's all calm down. Mike made a mistake, but we're family. We need to stick together. I couldn't hold it in anymore. Stick together? You've been covering for him his entire life. You're not helping him. You're enabling him. My dad shook his head like I was the one who didn't get it. He's had a rough time, Eli. You wouldn't understand. Life's been harder for him. Harder for him, I scoffed. He's been handed everything while I've had to work for everything I have. And look where it's gotten him. Arrested. Again. Frank raised a hand. Enough. This isn't going anywhere. Eli, go cool off. Sharon, Doug, you need to take a long, hard look at how you've been handling Mike, because the cops aren't going to let him off so easy next time. I didn't bother waiting for their response. I grabbed my jacket and went out to the garage to check on my truck. It had been towed back while we were still at the station, and seeing it up close made my blood boil all over again. The front bumper was mangled, the left headlight smashed, and the grille looked like it had been hit with a sledgehammer. The interior wasn't much better. Mud everywhere, and that same stale cigarette smell Mike had left the last time. It's just cosmetic, Mike had said. Like that was supposed to make it okay. The next day, I got a call from Mike. Somehow, he'd managed to get access to a phone from the county jail. I let it ring a few times before picking up. What do you want? Eli, I'm so sorry, man, he said, his voice trembling a little. This was all just a misunderstanding. I rolled my eyes. A misunderstanding? You stole my truck, wrecked it, and got arrested for a DUI. What part of that is confusing? He sighed. Look, I screwed up. I know that. But I need your help. Here it was, the real reason he called. What do you want, Mike? Bail me out, he said, as if it were the most reasonable request in the world. Mom and Dad don't have the money and... No, I cut him off. I'm not bailing you out. Eli, please, he begged. I can't stay in here. It's awful. These guys, they're rough. Maybe you should have thought about that before you stole my truck, I said coldly. You're on your own. I hung up before he could respond. A few minutes later, my mom called. Eli, you need to bail your brother out. Why can't you or Dad do it? I asked. We don't have that kind of money right now, she admitted. You know we've been helping him get back on his feet. I laughed bitterly. Helping him? You mean enabling him? Number, I'm done. Eli, don't be like this, she pleaded. He's your brother, and he's a grown man who needs to face the consequences of his actions, I said. Don't call me about this again. I hung up and blocked her number for the rest of the day. Later that evening, Frank came by with some news. So, turns out Mike's not just looking at a DUI. He's also facing charges for driving on a suspended license, reckless driving, and theft. Theft? I asked, surprised. Yeah, Frank said with a shrug. Technically, he stole your truck, and since you didn't give him permission, the cops added it to the list. For a second, I felt a pang of guilt. But then I thought about all the times Mike had taken advantage of me, all the excuses my parents had made for him, and all the crap I'd put up with. Good, I said. Maybe this'll finally teach him a lesson. Frank gave me a small nod of approval. We'll see. Knowing your parents, they'll try to smooth it over. Sure enough, my parents did just that. Over the next week, they scrambled to pull together money for Mike's bail, borrowing from family and even dipping into their retirement fund. When they finally got him out, he came straight to their house looking like he'd been through hell. Mike didn't say a word to me when I stopped by to grab some things I'd left in their garage. He just sat on the couch, staring at the floor. Part of me wanted to believe he'd finally learned his lesson, but deep down, I knew better. The fallout from Mike's arrest came fast and hard, and for once, I wasn't the one cleaning up his mess. He'd been charged with driving under the influence, driving on a suspended license, reckless driving, and theft. My parents did their usual scramble to shield him from the consequences, but this time it wasn't enough. The court wasn't buying their excuses. Mike's legal troubles piled up like snow in a blizzard. The judge didn't go easy on him, and while Uncle Frank had managed to get the DUI reduced to reckless driving, the rest of the charges stuck. Between court fees, fines, and mandatory probation check-ins, Mike was looking at thousands of dollars in penalties. The financial side of things hit Mike harder than the legal consequences. Now, with his license suspended and no real way to pay off his debts, the cracks in his entitled facade started to show. At first, Mike tried to lean on my parents to foot the bill for everything, like he always did, but even their resources were running dry. They'd already spent most of their savings bailing him out, and when he hit them up for cash to cover his probation fees, they finally put their foot down, sort of. Mike, we can't keep doing this, my mom said one evening, when I stopped by to pick up some of my tools. She was sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of bills in front of her, looking more stressed than I'd ever seen her. We've already borrowed from your Aunt Linda just to keep up with your court costs. Mike, sitting across from her with his arms crossed, looked annoyed. So what am I supposed to do? I can't work without a car, and I can't pay the fines if I'm not working. Well, my dad chimed in, trying to be the voice of reason. Maybe it's time to sell some of your things. The look on Mike's face was priceless. You'd think they just asked him to sell a kidney. Seriously? You want me to sell my stuff because of one little mistake? It wasn't one mistake, Mike, I cut in from the doorway. It was a series of bad decisions that got you here. Maybe it's time you face the consequences. He glared at me but didn't say anything. It was clear he didn't have a leg to stand on. Over the next few weeks, Mike's financial situation got worse. With no income and no car, he was forced to take a part-time job at a local pizza place as a delivery driver. The irony wasn't lost on me. Mike, the self-proclaimed golden boy, reduced to delivering pizzas on foot and borrowing my parents' ancient minivan when absolutely necessary. He hated every second of it. One time, when I was visiting Uncle Frank, Mike showed up to drop off a pizza order. The look on his face when he saw us was worth every headache he'd ever caused me. Frank gave him a little wave and said, "Good to see you working, Mike. Keep it up." Mike mumbled something under his breath and practically sprinted back to the minivan. I couldn't help but laugh. For the first time in his life, Mike was being humbled, and I was here for it. Despite everything, my parents couldn't fully let go of their golden boy. They continued to make excuses for him, even as they struggled to cover their own bills, thanks to all the money they'd thrown at his legal troubles. "Your brother's trying his best," my mom said one day when she called me, clearly fishing for sympathy. "You don't understand how hard this has been for him." "Hard for him?" I said, incredulous. "It's been hard for you because you keep cleaning up his messes. Maybe if you let him deal with this on his own, he'd finally learn something." "You don't know what it's like to have a child in trouble," she shot back. "You'd do the same thing if you were a parent." "No," I said firmly. "I wouldn't, because I'd raise my kid to take responsibility for their actions. Something you've never done with Mike. I'm that shut her up, at least for a moment. But I knew it wouldn't last. My parents were too deep in their enabling ways to change now. One evening, Mike showed up at my place unannounced. I opened the door to find him standing there, looking sheepish. "Can we talk?" he asked. I crossed my arms. "What do you want, Mike?" "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," he said, his voice unusually quiet. "For everything. Taking your truck, wrecking it, getting you caught up in my mess." For a moment, I almost believed him. But then he added, "So, I was wondering if you'd be willing to lend me some money, just to get me back on my feet." I laughed bitterly. "Are you serious? After everything you've put me through, you think I'm just going to hand you money?" "It's not like that," he said quickly. "I'd pay you back, like you paid Mom and Dad back for all the money they've spent on you," I shot back. "Mike, the answer is no. And don't bother asking again." His expression darkened. "You don't have to be such a jerk about it. Maybe if you'd learned how to take care of yourself years ago, you wouldn't be in this mess," I said. "This is your problem, Mike. Figure it out." He stormed off, muttering under his breath, and I slammed the door behind him. I was done. Done with Mike, done with my parents, and done with being dragged into their chaos. As Mike continued to struggle with his financial and legal troubles, I started to feel something I hadn't felt in years: peace. For once, I wasn't the one cleaning up his mess. I wasn't the one being blamed for his failures. He was finally being forced to face the consequences of his actions, and it felt good. Karma has a funny way of catching up to people, and it looks like Mike's finally getting his share. The fallout from Mike's antics didn't just hit him. It was like the entire family was falling apart, and I was the only one ready to walk away from the mess. My parents were struggling financially after bailing Mike out and covering his court costs, but instead of holding him accountable, they doubled down on their enabling ways. Meanwhile, Mike was still playing the victim, trying to weasel out of every responsibility like usual. It all came to a head one evening when my mom called me, asking for another favor. I picked up the phone, already bracing for what was coming. "Eli, we need to talk about Mike," she started in that tone that always signaled she was about to guilt trip me. "What about him?" I said, keeping my voice as neutral as possible. "Well, he's been having a really hard time," she said. "You know, with everything going on, the legal trouble, the job situation, we were hoping you could, I don't know, maybe let him stay with you for a little while, just until he gets back on his feet." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Are you kidding me?" I asked. "After everything he's done, you want me to take him in?" "It's not like that, Eli," she said, sounding exasperated. "He just needs a little support right now. He's your brother." I let out a bitter laugh. "No, Mom. If you want to keep enabling him, that's on you, but I'm done." After I hung up, I knew I was done. Not just with Mike, but with my parents too. For years, they'd treated me like I was less important, like my role in the family was to clean up after Mike and take the blame for his mistakes. I'd spent so much time trying to prove myself to them, but I realized something that night. I didn't owe them anything. The thing about cutting ties with toxic family members is that they don't always take no for an answer. My mom tried calling me a few times after that, leaving voicemails that swung between guilt tripping and outright denial. "Eli, we need to talk. This isn't like you," one message said. Another one was more dramatic. "I don't know what we did to deserve this, but you're breaking this family apart." Each time I deleted the messages without listening to the rest. I didn't owe them an explanation. I'd already made my decision, and I absolutely don't regret it.